In case you haven't encountered me already, let me introduce myself. I'm Deacon Cathy Johnson and I'm a deacon in the Richmond and Hounslow circuit. I've been asked to study with you the book of Esther, and we're going to take 2 sessions to do this. So today my purpose is to introduce you to the book itself and to read more closely the first 4 chapters. I'm hoping that we can attempt to see how it's still a relevant book to us today and whet your appetite enough for you to join me again tomorrow. I'll give you a spoiler alert. This book has everything you need for a rollicking good read. It has every element, and I mean everything, even suspense. So I'm going to be leaving you today with a cliffhanger. Although it has all the elements of a good book, it is surprising in its omission. The book of Esther can not only claim to be one of the only 2 books named for women, but it's unique in not one time mentioning God. It really is a wonder to me that it's made it into the canon, as it was compiled in the 5th century, of the Bible that we know today. Perhaps it's because, although tradition has it that it was written by Mordecai, who's a character in the book that we'll meet in a minute, the writing style has suggested to some scholars that it was perhaps written by Ezra or Nehemiah. And so, as this book follows those, perhaps this is the 3rd part of a trilogy, placed in our Bibles before Job and then Psalms. And incidentally, that's a good way to find it if you don't want to resort to an index. The Psalms are a nice big book, and then you can work back from there. I'm not sure that either Ezra or Nehemiah are the author, though, because they talk about God in their books, and they talk to God in their books. So we can only speculate as to who actually wrote this. Because of the story that it tells us and the way it's written, the book has been dated as being written around 500 BC. It tells us a story of daring do by a fair Jewish heroine in a time when the Persians had destroyed the Babylonian Empire, but many Jews had remained in the Babylonian area in exile. The book deals with a crisis for the exiles. Their future existence is threatened by genocide. To me, it seems likely that the story was written slightly after this time as a way of celebrating past glory and raising morale in a nation trying to return to the promised land and rebuild itself. This may explain why the end is so shockingly brutal. But it became such an important story that it found its way into Jewish texts and into our Bibles, and has become the basis for the Feast of Purim, which is still celebrated annually to this day. So now that we've covered the background, I'm going to read to you the entirety of chapter 1. And in some Bibles, the king is referred to by his Hebrew name, as he is here, and in other Bibles he's referred to as Xerxes. Chapter 1. This happened in the days of Ahasuerus, Xerxes, the same Ahasuerus who ruled over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. In those days, when King Ahasuerus sat on his throne in the citadel of Susa, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his officials and ministers. The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and governors of the provinces were present, while he displayed the great wealth of his kingdom and the splendour and pomp of his majesty for many days, 180 days in all. When these days were completed, the king gave for all the people present in the citadel of Susa, both great and small, a banquet lasting for 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were white cotton curtains and blue hangings tied with cords of fine linen and purple to silver rings and marble pillars. There were couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl and coloured stones. Drinks were served in golden goblets, goblets of different kinds, and the royal wine was lavished in accordance with the bounty of the king. Drinking was by flagons, without restraint, for the king had given orders to all the officials of his palace to do as each one desired. Furthermore, Queen Vashti gave a banquet for the women in the palace of King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, when the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuim, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, and Abagtha, Zethar and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who attended him, to bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing the royal crown, in order to show the peoples and officials her beauty, for she was fair to behold. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command conveyed by the eunuchs. At this the king was enraged and his anger burned within him. Then the king consulted the sages who knew the laws, for this was the king's procedure towards all who were versed in law and custom. And those next to him were Karshena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Merez, Marsena, and Memucan, the 7 officials of Persia and Media who had access to the king and sat first in the kingdom. According to the law, what is to be done to Queen Vashti because she's not performed the command of King Ahasuerus conveyed by the eunuchs? Then Memucan said in the presence of the king and the officials, not only has Queen Vashti done wrong to the king, but also to all the officials and all the peoples who are in all the provinces of the king. For this deed of the queen will be made known to all women, causing them to look with contempt on their husbands, since they will say, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come. This very day the noble ladies of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's behaviour will rebel against the king's officials, and there will be no end to their contempt and wrath. If it pleases the king, let a royal order go out before him, and let it be written amongst the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be altered, that Vashti is never again to come before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. So when the decree made by the king is proclaimed throughout all his kingdom, vast as it is, all women will give honour to their husbands, high and low alike. This advice pleased the king and the officials, and the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent letters to all the royal provinces, to every province in its own script, and to every people in its own language, declaring that every man should be master in his own house. Well, the first thing that strikes me is how sophisticated this society is, and how lavish the lifestyle at court is. At this time, the British Isles was still in the middle of the Iron Age. Then I'm struck by how dangerous it is to live in those times, particularly if you are in the vicinity of Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, as I think I might call him from now on, because I find it easier. Especially if you are a woman. As soon as Vashti is mentioned in the story, we learn that she is very beautiful. And she has to appear at the king's side wearing her crown. What stronger statement could there be to demonstrate that she is his trophy wife? We're told that Xerxes immediately flies into a rage when she refuses to appear, and the flames of his anger are further fanned by his wise male advisors who tell him that she's setting an appalling example of defiance to women everywhere. There will be no end to their contempt and anger. We're immediately made aware of the position of women in Persian society. Despite being queen, Vashti has no rights, so has to rely on her looks to survive in this patriarchal society. This is a very precarious position to be in. So maybe this first question we should ask ourselves is, what would we have done in her position? Would we have stood up to the king? Is there sometimes a less confrontational approach to a problem that arises from somebody making an irrational demand? Although this court scene is an unfamiliar context to us, there are women who regularly find themselves treated as possessions and abused. So maybe we should be thinking about how we can support organisations that tackle this dangerous issue. So this is the threatening environment into which Esther is introduced. And at this point you may want to pause the video and read for yourself chapter 2 verses 1 to 14. Once Xerxes realises what he's done, he doesn't reinstate Vashti, but looks to replace her. He's not felt attached to her as a person, it seems, but misses what he could take from her. So this part of the story tells us about how Esther comes into the picture. She's living with her cousin Mordecai, who adopted her when she was an orphan, and so the decree that all young virgins in the land must go to Susa includes her. She's taken into the first harem, where she's in the care of Haggai, who is very fond of her, but she doesn't tell anyone that she's a Jew. So I'll leave you to read that part of the story and just read to you chapter 2, verses 15b to 20. Now Esther was admired by all who saw her. When Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus in his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the other women. Of all the virgins, she won his favour and devotion, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great banquet to all his officials and ministers, Esther's banquet. He also granted a holiday to the provinces and gave gifts with royal liberality. When the virgins were being gathered together, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Now Esther had not revealed her kindred or her people, as Mordecai had charged her, for Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up by him. So Esther receives all the beauty treatments and training she needs to progress to the second harem, where the king's wives live. And the king is so happy with her beauty that he takes her to be his queen in Vashti's place. This makes me ponder on the fact that life can feel like a beauty contest. Success in our society is seen in terms of wealth and beauty. We have a celebrity culture now. So the question is, how do we, as Christians, respond to living in such an environment? We are wonderfully made, Psalm 137 tells us, and made in God's image. That's in Genesis 1. How does that help us to counter the voices of the world that tell us that we should be more attractive? How does that affect how we respond to other people? Who do we not welcome into our church? Is there a particular type of person who fits or who does not? And then in the next part of chapter 2, which I will leave you to read again, it ends with a parallel story, because while Esther is gaining favour with the king, Mordecai is also being promoted in court. He overhears a plot to assassinate the king, reports it to Esther, and she tells the king, and the two conspirators are executed. The plot and its discovery are put on record, including Mordecai's part in foiling it. And so it is at this point that the story has a theme that is echoed in Daniel. Mordecai is a faithful Jew. He refuses to recognise the ultimate authority of the king. God is his one authority. But God still is not actually mentioned here. We're just led to understand it that way. Mordecai's passive resistance is explained in terms of his religion, not in reference to God explicitly. And we're going to pick this up in chapter 3, verses 1 to 7. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the officials who were with him. And the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and did obeisance to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or do obeisance. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you not disobey the king's command?" When they spoke to him day after day and he would not listen to them, they told Haman, in order to see whether Mordecai's words would avail, for he had told them he was a Jew. Then Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or do obeisance to him. Haman was infuriated. But he thought it beneath him to lay hands on Mordecai alone, so having been told who Mordecai's people were, Haman plotted to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. In the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of the king's reign, they cast pur, which means the lot, before Haman for the day and for the month, and the lot fell on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Selwyn Hughes said, "There is no other book in all the Bible where God is more evidently at work behind the scenes." I think that this goes to the heart of why I find this book relatable despite its antiquity. God is not mentioned, but God is most definitely there. To me, this speaks into my Christian experience in the 21st century. Many of us are faithful Christians, influenced by our faith and sure that God is in our lives. But we don't necessarily hear the voice of God speaking to us. We don't necessarily have Damascus Road experiences or wonderful life-changing visions. We just keep going and we keep believing. So I ask you, are you aware of God evidently at work behind the scenes in your life? Can you review your experiences and see that God has purpose for you? What follows in the rest of chapter 3, and again I will ask you to read that yourselves, is a deadly plot by Haman, the enemy of the Jews, to bribe Xerxes to exterminate the Jewish people. Remember, nobody at court knows that Esther is also a Jew. Esther hears that Mordecai is staging a protest very bravely, but she seems completely unaware of the reason for his distress, despite the fact that we're told that the whole fortress of Susa is in confusion or uproar. So this reminds us that her existence is very likely to be one where she is shut away in seclusion when the king has no need of her, and her contact with the outside world is thus extremely limited. Perhaps we can identify her with her more closely at the moment as we find ourselves shut away. I'm going to take up the story again at chapter 4, verses 10 to 17, where Esther responds to Mordecai's plea that she should go and intercede for her people and beg for mercy. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and gave him a message for Mordecai, saying, "All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law. All alike are to be put to death. Only if the king holds out the golden scepter to someone may that person live. I myself have not been called to come into the king for 30 days. When they told Mordecai what Esther had said, Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silence at such time as this, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another quarter, but you and your father's family will perish. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this." Then Esther said in reply to Mordecai, "Go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf, and neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will fast as you do, and after that I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." Mordecai then went away and did everything that Esther had ordered him. Again, God is not mentioned explicitly, but Esther clearly takes to heart the phrase, "Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for such a time as this?" We're asked to reflect. Do we recognise God's timing in our lives? When doors have closed to us, Do we see God's guiding hand and trust in God? Have you ever thought that suddenly you realise that everything that's gone before has led you to a particular time and place where you're called to say or do something? Was it completely outside your comfort zone, but you felt compelled to take action? Are we perhaps Christians for just such a time as this? And so our readings today leave us with a cliffhanger. Esther is fearing for her life, knowing full well that Xerxes is a violent and impetuous man, and that she is in a vulnerable position, made more precarious by the fact that she has kept her faith and her origins quiet. In the next session, we will see how this scenario plays out and find out if she survives. Before we end, I invite you to pray with me. Loving God, the peace you give us is far better than worldly peace. We are precious to you no matter what we have done, where we have been, and how we look. You do not judge us at face value, but see our innermost thoughts, dreams, and desires. Help us not to judge each other. Guide us to seek ways to bring resolution and healing to broken relationships. Give us strength to stand up for what is right. May we see your hand in our daily lives and learn to trust your purpose for us. May we find ourselves to be the people we are for just such a time as this. We pray in the name of Jesus. Amen. Thank you for joining me, and I hope you will join with me in the next session.